so much of what we achieve, well, it really hinges on what we start with, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
Whether you're, I don't know, baking a cake or building a business strategy, those initial ingredients, they just dictate the outcome.
Spot on.
And that brings us to a concept originally from the tech world that I find just endlessly applicable. Garbage in, garbage out, GIGO.
Yeah, GIGO, a classic, and for good reason. If you put flawed data into any system, computer program, a decision process, whatever,
Yeah.
you're almost guaranteed flawed results.
Yeah, it's pretty intuitive when you put it like that.
Mm-hmm.
And what's fascinating, I think, is how this simple idea stretches into areas you might not immediately think of, like risk management.
Right.
You'd think with all the frameworks and methodologies, risk management would be sort of immune to just bad input.
You might think that, yeah.
But as we've looked into, that's definitely not the case, not at all. In fact, there are, several ways GIGO can really undermine even, well-intentioned risk management efforts.
That's right. We're not just talking the obvious, bad data gives you bad analysis. We've kind of identified a few distinct, let's call them flavors of GIGO that can creep in.
Flavors. Okay, I'm intrigued.
Yeah. So you've got your standard GIGO, bad input, bad output, simple enough. But then there's this more interesting one we're calling garbage in, gospel out.
Garbage in, gospel out.
Yeah, where flawed initial information somehow gets treated as like absolute truth as it moves through the process. It gains this unwarranted credibility.
Wow, okay. That sounds like a recipe for disaster. A small error at the start just snowballs.
Precisely. And then there's the flip side, too. Gospel in, garbage out.
Okay, so the opposite.
Kind of. This happens when you actually start with good, solid information, but the process itself, somehow, it corrupts it. You end up with unreliable outputs anyway.
Right. So our deep dive today is really about unpacking these different ways GIGO can show up in risk management.
Mm-hmm.
Our mission, really, is to help everyone kind of spot these pitfalls and, more importantly, give some practical ways to make sure the effort you put into risk assessment actually gives you results you can trust, results you can act on.
Yeah, it's about making sure that investment in risk management, time, resources actually pays off, that the insights are, grounded in reality.
All right, so let's start with the basics then. The original GIGO.
Yeah.
How does that simple truth, bad input leads to bad output, play out specifically in risk management? What does garbage in even look like here?
Well, at its most basic, if the info you're using, to identify risks, assess them, decide how to respond, if that info is flawed right from the start, the whole process is just compromised.
Okay.
So think about what makes for poor input in this field.
Well, one thing that springs to mind immediately is like a lack of clear objectives.
Yes.
If you don't have a really clear picture of what you're trying to achieve, how can you possibly spot the risks that might stop you? It's like trying to navigate without knowing where you're going.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
Exactly. Vague goals or goals that keep changing make it incredibly hard to figure out what's actually a risk.
Okay, so unclear objectives. What else?
Another big one is just poor risk identification, plain and simple.
Right.
If you don't dedicate the time and, frankly, the effort to really explore all the potential threats and opportunities too, you're just bound to miss crucial things.
So like a quick brainstorming session where only the really obvious stuff gets mentioned. That kind of thing.
Exactly that. Or maybe, an overly narrow focus, only looking at financial risks, say, and completely ignoring operational or reputational ones.
Tunnel vision.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And then there's the issue of picking the wrong risk responses.
How so?
Well, if your initial assessment of how likely a risk is or how bad the impact could be, if that's way off, then the response you choose is probably going to be wrong too. Either not enough to actually deal with the threat or maybe way too much, just draining resources unnecessarily. That mismatch between the actual risk and the chosen response, that's a clear case of garbage in leading to garbage out.
It's quite sobering, isn't it, to think that even with the best intentions, genuinely wanting to manage risks well, the whole thing can be undermined right at the start just by the quality of the info you feed in.
Precisely. You could have the most sophisticated software, the fanciest templates, the most advanced analysis techniques, but none of that will magically fix flawed foundational data. The output can only ever be as good as the input. It just reflects it.
Okay. Got a good handle on classic GIGO now. Let's tackle this more intriguing one you mentioned. Garbage in, gospel out. It sounds, frankly, a bit alarming. How does that happen in risk management? What makes it so dangerous?
Yeah, it is a bit insidious. Garbage in, gospel out happens when the outputs, the results of your risk process, are treated as absolute truth, gospel.
Right.
Even if the initial data that went in was, questionable, shaky maybe.
But why would people do that?
Well, often it comes from maybe not fully understanding how the process works under the hood, or perhaps just an over-reliance on the perceived objectivity of systems and software.
Ah, the black box effect.
Kind of, yeah. When you see a seemingly authoritative report or a very precise-looking number, there's just this human tendency, isn't there, to accept it at face value without really questioning it.
I can definitely see that. If some risk tool spits out, I don't know, a 78.3% probability for something, it's tempting to just take that number as fact, even if the data or the assumptions behind it were, well, flimsy.
Exactly. If that initial estimate, the 78.3%, was based on maybe just a gut feeling or a tiny data set, then that apparent precision carries this false sense of accuracy. The way it's presented, maybe a slick dashboard, a detailed report, it can mask how weak the underlying data actually is.
And then you make decisions based on that mirage of accuracy.
That's the risk. You end up making decisions based on something that looks solid but isn't.
So we might just fail to apply our own critical thinking. We don't realize the output needs interpreting with, a healthy dose of skepticism, considering where it came from.
That's the core danger, yes. We can become complacent. We assume, oh, the system generated it, it must be right.
Which is especially risky in risk management.
Absolutely. Because we're often dealing with future uncertainties, with subjective judgments about likelihood and impact. If those initial judgments are poor, but they get presented as fact, the resulting gospel can lead to really flawed decisions, maybe a false sense of security, or maybe unnecessary panic.
It really drives home the point, doesn't it? That risk management tools, processes, they're aids to our judgment. They're not substitutes for it.
Couldn't agree more. We always need to keep that critical perspective on the results.
Always questioning.
Always. The output's reliability is just fundamentally tied to the quality of its foundation. We should always be ready to challenge, to scrutinize the results, no matter how polished they look.
Okay, now let's flip it. The third variation. Gospel in, garbage out. This one still seems almost paradoxical to me. How can good, solid, high-quality input end up producing bad output?
Yeah, it does seem odd at first glance. This happens when the risk management process itself introduces errors, or somehow distorts the perfectly good data that you fed into it initially. So even if you've done a brilliant job identifying risks, gathering robust information about them, a flawed process can still mess things up and lead to unreliable results.
So the initial data's fine, the intentions are good, but something goes wrong during the analysis. Or the reporting.
Exactly. One very common cause is simply a lack of enough time or attention or resources given to the risk management work. If risk assessments are rushed, if the people doing it are totally overloaded, or if they don't have the right tools, errors can easily slip in. Mistakes happen.
Like cutting corners during the analysis, or maybe not properly documenting why certain assessments were made.
Precisely. Another factor can be using the wrong tools or techniques for the job. Okay, say trying to apply some really complex quantitative analysis when the data you actually have is mostly qualitative, descriptive. That can generate seriously misleading results, even if the initial qualitative judgments were perfectly sound. It's just a mismatch between the method and the data.
So you're forcing a level of precision or maybe rigor that the information just can't realistically support.
That's a very good way to put it. Yes. And then there's the crucial element of expertise, risk management skills.
The people doing it.
Exactly. If the people involved don't have the necessary knowledge or skills or experience, they might misinterpret data, apply techniques the wrong way, or just draw flawed conclusions, even if they're working with excellent initial information. Think of it like a skilled musician with a really fine instrument. They can still produce a jarring sound if they don't play it correctly.
That makes sense. It really highlights that just having a well-defined risk framework on paper isn't enough.
Not at all.
The people actually doing it need to be competent, and they need to be properly supported with time, resources, training.
Absolutely. A flawed process, whether it's because of resource issues, unsuitable methods, or lack of expertise, can unfortunately take good gospel, your high-quality starting info, and turn it into garbage outputs you just can't rely on.
Wow. Okay, this paints a pretty comprehensive picture of all the ways things can go wrong. So what's the solution? What's the antidote? How do we safeguard our risk management efforts against all these GIGO variations?
Well, the good news is there is a powerful antidote. It works against all forms of GIGO in risk management, and we can boil it down to two key actions. Together, they form the acronym VVO.
VVO.
VVO. Verify in, validate out. Think of them as essential filters you need to apply throughout your risk management process.
VVO, verify in, validate out. I like the sound of that. Okay, let's break it down. First part, verify in. What does that actually involve specifically when we're talking risk management?
Verifying the input means rigorously, and I mean rigorously, examining the data that forms the foundation of your risk assessment.
Okay.
It means asking a whole series of critical questions like, is this information complete? Are there obvious gaps we need to fill? Is it current? Is it up to date? Or are we relying on old stuff, old assumptions? How trustworthy is the source? Is there any potential bias here, conscious or unconscious, that might be skewing the data?
Good question.
Is the information based on solid evidence? Reliable sources? Or is it mostly just speculation? How accurate is it, as far as we can tell? And crucially, is it actually relevant to the specific risk we're trying to understand?
Relevance, yeah.
Ultimately, the core question you have to keep asking is this information as true and reliable as we can reasonably make it?
Those are definitely probing questions. And like we touched on earlier, it feels challenging in risk management where you're often dealing with probabilities, potential future stuff, not always hard facts.
You're absolutely right. Achieving absolute certainty with risk management inputs, often impossible. The uncertainty is inherent.
So what's the point then?
Well, that inherent uncertainty doesn't mean we just throw our hands up. It doesn't diminish the importance of striving for the highest possible quality of input data we can get.
Okay.
It means we have to actively challenge assumptions. We need to seek out diverse perspectives, not just listen to the echo chamber, cross-reference information from different sources whenever we can, and be really transparent about the limitations of the data we are using.
Right. Acknowledge the fuzzy bits.
Exactly. So even if perfect verification isn't possible, making a diligent effort to verify, that dramatically reduces the amount of garbage getting into the system in the first place.
Okay, that makes sense. So that's verify. And really kicking the tires on the initial data.
There.
Now, what about the second part of VVO? Validate out. How do we effectively check if the results, the outputs of our risk process, are actually sound? Are they reliable?
Validating the output is all about critically evaluating the results of your risk analysis. You're trying to determine if they're logical, if they're reasonable, if they align with your broader understanding of the risks.
The sense check.
Precisely. Key questions to ask here include, do these results generally make sense in the context of what we know?
Okay.
If there are unexpected outcomes, weird results, have we really dug into why they look that way? Are the results that seem counterintuitive? Or just way out of line with our expectations?
And if so?
If so, why? What could be causing that? Is it bad input we missed? A process error? A genuinely surprising risk we hadn't considered? Also, do the current assessments show a consistent trend compared to previous ones? Or compared to benchmarks?
Looking for patterns.
Yes. Can we maybe use a different method or different data just to cross-check the results, see if they roughly line up?
Triangulation.
Exactly. And maybe the most important question, do we have enough confidence in these results to actually make decisions based on them? To take action?
So it's really about applying that layer of critical judgment to the outputs, isn't it?
Yeah.
Not just blindly accepting whatever the spreadsheet or the software spits out.
Couldn't have said it better myself. It is a sense check. Look, sometimes risk analysis will reveal surprising insights, things you didn't expect. That's part of its value.
Sure.
But generally speaking, the outputs should be logical. They should be explainable if the process and the input data were sound.
Right.
If you get a result that just feels completely out of left field, totally bizarre, that's a huge red flag. It's a strong signal that something might have gone wrong somewhere, either with the input or the analysis itself. It tells you, dig deeper, question assumptions, test these findings before you bet the farm on them.
So we need to be ready to challenge even things that look authoritative. Not be afraid to ask, hang on, does this really make sense?
Precisely. Validation is about making sure that the gospel out, the results, the insights you generate can actually stand up to scrutiny, that they provide a reliable basis for making decisions.
Okay, so just to pull it all together then. By consistently applying this VVO framework, verify the input and validate the output, we can significantly cut down the risks from all three types of GIGO in our risk management work, whatever that work might be.
That's the key takeaway. Whether it's personal risk, project risk, huge organizational risks, Implementing these two crucial filters, verify in and validate out, will seriously boost the reliability and the usefulness of what you get out of the process.
And it's a good reminder, too, that just doing risk management in the first place is vital because, as we sort of hinted, there's something even worse than GIGO.
Oh, yes. NINO.
Nothing in, nothing out. You can't expect any benefit if you don't put anything in to start with. No effort, no insight.
That's the fundamental starting point, isn't it? Vivo helps ensure that the effort you do put in is actually worthwhile, that it leads to valuable, trustworthy results.
This has been a really, really useful deep dive. Taking a principle that seems so simple, GIGO, but seeing its profound implications for something as critical as risk management.
Indeed. At the end of the day, being constantly mindful of the quality of what goes into your risk processes and rigorously evaluating what comes out, that's just crucial for generating insights that actually help you make better decisions and, achieve what you set out to achieve.
Absolutely. And on that note, maybe here's a final thought for everyone listening to mull over. Think about a recent decision you made, maybe big or small, that was based on some kind of data or analysis. Knowing what we've discussed today, what specific steps could you have taken, perhaps, to better verify the input, the information you relied on, and maybe validate the output, the conclusions you reach, just to be that much more confident in your decision? Where might a little VO have helped?